Right off the bat, the second episode of Log Horizon establishes that players will come back to life in the cathedral if they die in battle. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that this show is never precious with information. Something new is being established about the world or characters in nearly every scene, and it never keeps you waiting around to discover the truth. I've been on record as having a distaste for mystery shows, and my reasoning is that I don't like feeling as though I'm just waiting around for a reveal. When a show raises a question in its writing, it has two options for what it can do in the time before that question is answered. Either leave it alone and let it fall to the back of your mind until the secret is revealed, or continue to repeat the question and tease at the possible answer in order to keep the viewer anticipating a plot twist. In the latter case, I've found that unless the answer is already evident enough that you could have figured it out on your own before the end, then 100% of the time it will be unsatisfying in direct proportion to how much it was built up. As such, I have learned to never be interested in a show's mystery unless it actually suggests intriguing things about the world and characters, and that's where we come to Log Horizon, a show which is constantly feeding you information, raising questions, and then leaving them in the back of your mind until reveals that you didn't even realize you were waiting for, and leaving mysterious for the long term only the questions that are actually more intriguing to not know the answers to. But we'll talk more about all that later. It would be easy to imagine another show dedicating an entire episode solely to the build-up to whether or not dying in the game had consequences, and almost certainly using a main character's death to test it out in highly dramatic fashion. But here it's brushed off right at the start of the second episode when it happens to someone else entirely. This decision was made because knowing that you can come back to life is kind of integral to the story this show wants to tell. If you'll remember from part 1, the idea of homesteading the noosphere centers around giving hackers the means to sustain themselves and letting their individuality run rampant, and Log Horizon does this in the most literal way imaginable. It's unfortunate that a lot of viewers seem to lose interest in the series as soon as they make this discovery, because we will eventually realize that it's kind of a misdirect. There are consequences for dying, as we'll discover later, but more importantly, it's the fact that death is impossible which leads to the existential question to come to the forefront of everyone's minds of how to make life meaningful when subsistence is taken care of. And for the audience this show is aimed at, that might very well be a pressing question, but we'll get into that in a deeper way when the time comes. For now, I just want to be clear that whereas I've seen many people state that they were more invested in Sword Art Online specifically because of the high stakes of knowing that dying in the game meant dying in real life, it was the discovery that the opposite was true which made me more interested in Log Horizon. After all, death as a result of dying is already a fact of my everyday life, which I don't need an isekai story to help me explore. Functional immortality, on the other hand, is a theoretical possibility which tickles the imagination. After the OP, we watch a bit of our heroes adventuring together as Shiroe reiterates the function of how using skills is possible in this world, and the idea that use and mastery are different, with an unsureness of whether training in the same way that one does IRL would work in this world. This is one of those aforementioned mysteries which the show is content to just leave lingering in the back of your mind, though admittedly it does so for so long that many viewers will probably have forgotten about it by the time the idea starts getting really fleshed out in Season 2. Having read a bit of the light novels, I think this is partially the consequence of the adaptation, since there are more errant mental remarks about the status of the character's physical changes over the course of the source material, but nonetheless, I think it was fair to leave this question unanswered until the characters had spent a really significant amount of time in this world. After all, Log Horizon is based on the old school style of MMORPGs, in which you could be playing for months and months and still not have seen all of what the game had to offer. Being at level cap with epic raid armor was a sincere accomplishment, and since our characters have started off at that baseline, their grind has to be towards something unique. Of course, I can only think this romantically about these scenes having watched the show twice. Before moving on, I have to mention how much I appreciate the frequent use of quick montages throughout the series, always communicating that the characters have spent a significant amount of time exploring and testing all the possibilities of what they can do before drawing conclusions. There are so many moving parts to Log Horizon's world, all of which need to be understood to sell some of its really big dramatic moments, and there would only be two other ways to educate the viewer on every discovery made by the characters. Either to show us every single step of their journey and let us discover this information with them, or create convenient scenarios wherein they just happen to learn all kinds of different possibilities from a single encounter. Log Horizon makes the right choice in splitting the difference to retain both realism and brevity, and saving the in-depth exploration for the moments when it needs to pop. Speaking of moving parts, the following scene establishes establishes the existence of unique character classes, of which Akatsuki belongs to the Tracker class. Log Horizon frequently takes little aside moments to explain which attributes of MMORPGs are also attributes of this world, usually in ways which feel like casual world building, only for them to turn out massively important later. Possibly the single biggest twist in the entire show revolves around Shiroe's subclass, and considering what a hard sell that scene would have been otherwise, it's direly important that every single aspect of what happens there is established gradually over the course of the show leading up to it, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. The structure of this episode's first half is fascinating in how it jumps all over the timeline in order to create a cohesive train of narrative thought and engaging visual experience while communicating as much information as possible. We move from an action scene right after the OP into a narrated montage, into a light comedic moment, get a soft tonal reset from the title card, then dive into a dialogue scene intercut with a narrated presentation to the viewers, then a walking dialogue scene kept interesting by more wide-angle environmental shots which use foreground elements for transition, and then from there back into an earlier exposition scene by way of flashback, kept entertaining by details like Henrietta brushing Akatsuki's hair, which itself cuts away to shots of the towns or the fields. And if you just watch this episode casually, you probably won't even notice just how deftly it's moving between such a huge variety of settings and subject matters all at once. Yet even in all this hyper-condensed information, it can still take moments for bits of flair, like Akatsuki mentioning how her favorite goblins are the ones that wear skulls on their head cause it's weird and cute. The very first sentences of that flashback scene establish that security has gotten bad in the city, that there was a rush to purchase all of the guild halls in town which has already started slowing down, and that the balance of power therein is settling into place. That's enough political movement going on that it could have been the focus of its own entire episode. But then once again, when a show has this much going on, you could decompress any of it and triple the length of the narrative. But Log Horizon has specific thematic fish to fry and would prefer to get the groundwork laid as fast as possible. We also learn about the rise of player killings in the fields and the mechanics of how they are avoided in towns, which will be hugely important later. But my favorite line in this flashback is when Shiroe remarks that the player killings are so frequent because the pros and cons have been reversed. Shiroe is such a great character and a perfect protagonist for this story precisely because he views things in this highly rational, cut and dry kind of way. It's not that he's unemotional or without morals, but his initial reaction to anything is to analyze the mechanics of why it's happening as objectively as possible and then to make judgments about it afterwards. And it's clear that action taking doesn't come as naturally to him as problem solving, all of which he will be taken to task for later. Another advantage of the way this first quarter of the episode is structured is how it allows the player-killer ambush to feel natural. Most shows would have started with the scene in the guild hall establishing the player-killer situation, and then had the characters immediately get attacked by them later in the field, which would seem unrealistically convenient and cartoony. By having already framed this attack scene as coming after a montage of the characters adventuring, and then suggested that the flashback scene took place even earlier, it feels as though plenty of time has passed between that dialogue and the ambush itself, and thus it feels natural. Said ambush amounts to a lengthy action scene with some fairly standard and cliched player-killer villains whom you would expect to find in a story like this, and here's where I must reiterate how the opening arc of Log Horizon is kind of the worst part of the show, especially on the first viewing. Again, not for being actually bad, but for taking so long to really get into the heart of what makes the series good, and in a way, it kinda had to be like this. If you haven't watched much of this show, or caught on by this point, Log Horizon is about build-up. It takes place in a very densely detailed setting and features a massive cast, and each of the big pop moments in the story comes as a result of so many different established pieces being locked into place all at once with a big reveal. As such, it asks patience of the viewer. It doesn't hype itself up out the gate with the main character placing himself in opposition to the rest of society, nor lay some incredibly impending threat over the heads of the populace, but instead takes its time normally establishing new things about the world at a regular clip until it can leverage all of that setup to land a really dramatic moment, which sounds like and is an ideal way of telling a great story, but is so different from the way that most modern media is formatted that it's difficult to anticipate. If you're watching Log Horizon for the first time knowing nothing about it, the first 4-episode arc might lead you to believe that it was a fantasy action series, considering that there's a minutes-long fight scene in every episode. You might then be surprised surprised to realize that after episode 4, there isn't a significant battle scene again in the entire following 6-episode arc. Fighting is important to Log Horizon, but only because fighting is important to MMORPGs, and so many of their mechanics function in service of it. Considering that the people who've been trapped in this world are all regular humans from our world, the rules regarding how humans act and how a society should ideally function for them don't need to be explained, whereas everything that's different about the physical reality of this world needs to be understood in depth to grasp how those humans are going to build that society therein. Moreover, taken as a parable of how a society becomes established from the ground floor, the rise from rule of violence to rule of diplomacy is a necessary step in the narrative. But again, we don't know from the start that this is the show's plan, and so we have no reason to think that anything will change. None of this is to say that I necessarily have a problem with the fights in themselves. After all, just like the rest of the show, they're leaden with new information establishing the functionality of the world and are extremely tactics driven over flashiness or choreography. I've always been a fan of tactical combat scenes in anime, though it's rare that even the most cleverly constructed action scene will stick out in my mind in the way that a perfectly orchestrated dramatic one will. Being as I am the kind of snob who drops a show as soon as my attention lapses for more than 30 seconds, I obviously was entertained by these scenes even on my first time through the series, but I definitely feel that their most important purpose was simply to fully acclimate us to all of the combat possibilities in this world before we would need to know about them later. You could almost say that every single thing we learn about combat in this arc and how dungeons work in the show's midsection is all just for the payoff of the really insane tactics that we'll get towards the end of the raid excursion in season 2, but as with every other aspect of the series, we start small and we build up. After the battle is over, it's Shiroe's observations about it which get back to the real point of the show. He muses that people are killing each other simply because there's nothing better to do, no goal to live for. Even though the party agrees that this is a pathetic reason to turn to harassment, Shiroe nonetheless can't shake the feeling that he's not particularly doing anything himself either, so who is he to judge? Eventually I'm going to make the case that being an adventurer in this show is just a metaphor for being a first world internet denizen who doesn't know what to do with themselves because their basic needs are so easily met, and most of society hasn't imagined far beyond subsistence as the modus operandi of existence. But for now, I bring it up only to suggest that player killings in this world are kind of a metaphor for internet trolling and harassment, with characters often parroting the sentiment that since it's all just a game with no real consequences, there's nothing wrong with what they're doing, in a similar way to how internet trolls will often excuse their actions. The second half of the episode finally establishes our hero's first proper quest, a rescue mission to pick up a member of the Crescent Moon Guild from the northern town of Susukino, which has been completely dominated by violent rule. I won't go into detail about all the exposition since it mostly consists of world building needed to justify the plot, all of which is interesting but not worth getting analytical about. The most important thing about this entire arc is simply that it gets the main characters out of Akiba and gives us a chance to explore for a bit. Once again, this is a way in which the first arc of Log Horizon kinda gives you the wrong impression of the show in a way that is ultimately necessary. Most of the time, this is going to be a show about characters having long conversations in boardrooms or roaming around Akiba managing society, with only a handful of straight-up adventures over the course of the series, most of which come in Season 2. Nevertheless, we need to have a solid understanding of what this MMO world is like and how it functions in order to set things up before we can really get into the nitty-gritty of its politics. So sending the characters on a long-distance quest was a great way to establish a vertical slice of the setting. Moreover, it's a good excuse to divorce them from the town for long enough that the social structure of it can fully solidify before Shiroe goes about dismantling and restructuring it later. In retrospect, sending them on this mission was incredibly crafty as a storytelling device, just one that, as usual, doesn't show much of the writer's hand until he drops the flush on you later. In spite of all that though, this episode did manage to give me my first big come in the series on my initial viewing when Shiroe and Naotsugu summoned their griffins and took Akatsuki up on a ride. You see, while Log Horizon may not do an incredible job of capturing the appeal of itself in these early episodes, it does a phenomenal job of capturing the appeal of an MMORPG. While I personally have never been the biggest MMO player, I've always been fascinated with the genre and had friends who were addicted to them, and I think that Log Horizon captures all of the most romantic and appealing aspects of the games better than many of the games themselves. Just the idea that not only did these two guys own these epic mounts, which such a small handful of players have ever seen that a fellow level 90 player is blown away by their existence, but that they deliberately kept them on the down down low and only let their own party members know about them just because they're a couple of pretentious shifty fucks made me completely fall in love with this show's whole mentality. It's not something which I expect every viewer to resonate with the same way, but watching this scene for the first time back in 2014 was the catalyst for all of the videos that I made about both this show and Sword Art Online at the time, because of how strongly I felt that this show had gotten right everything that one had gotten wrong about MMOs. Of course, a huge part of that impact came from that fucking song. You know the one. It doesn't play for the first time in this scene, as it's in practically every single episode of the show, but this was the place where it struck me on my first viewing. And honestly, I think it's probably my favorite piece of soundtrack music ever. Is it a cliched epic fantasy feels tune? Absolutely. Is it even better than the one from The Lord of the Rings? I think the argument can be made. Every scene this song plays in is basically a 10 out of 10 for me automatically. It's such a tense, pensive, and mesmerizing song with its drawn-out notes constantly soaring and falling, somehow conveying every conceivable emotion at the same time, like witnessing something so overwhelmingly awesome that it simultaneously makes you ecstatic to be seeing it and depressed to know that it's going to end and put you back into a state of not seeing it. I couldn't even imagine Log Horizon without this song. Now, if I had to pick the least memorable episode of Log Horizon, I'd go with episode 3. Our heroes plunge the depths of a dungeon, clearly copying the aesthetic of the Mines of Moria, while mostly reiterating world-building points which were already established previously. It's likely the writers were trying to hammer in the whole point about how bad the food tastes in this world so that the payoff would be that much sweeter in episode 5, and considering how dense the first 2 episodes were, I'd say it was a good idea to remind the audience about certain things which are going to be more relevant to the near future of the plot, but this is one of the few parts of the show which is actually less interesting on a second viewing. The best scene comes 7 minutes in when we meet Serada for the first time, and her establishing monologue is perfect. Moaning about how her housekeeping skill has gone from 42 to 44 over the past day is a hilarious, endearing, and distinctly gamey way to immediately put us into her shoes, realizing the boredom of waiting around and hiding. Her realization that she might just be a housewife and simultaneous embarrassment and excitement over the prospect practically tells us everything that we're going to need to know about the character, and you'll probably decide right away how you feel about her. A lot of people seem to find Serada's voice obnoxious, and I could easily see why since it is gratingly high-pitched, but I personally found it adorable. I can't necessarily defend Misaki Kuno as an actress since I did find her totally annoying in Selector Infected Weakros and Durarara, but this is probably my favorite of her roles. I'm also a huge fan of Serada's character design. The interplay of earthy browns and soft pink is super cute and girly in a way that's not over the top, and I love how baggy and flowy all of her outfit's components are. She's kind of like a human Ugg boot, or someone who tumbled through a Swedish Hig aesthetic clothespin. I also love that she represents one of the only times that a cute anime girl complains about getting chubby and is actually believable. Since you can't see much of her body and her face is on the round side, you can actually imagine that maybe she's put on some weight underneath all those layers, and season 2 leans in on this idea even harder, making it very clear that she's been hitting up those Akiba holiday cake parties. Shortly after Serada's introduction, we then meet her rescuer and one of my favorite things about Log Horizon, Nyanta. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call Nyanta one of my outright favorite characters because my affection for him is at least a little bit ironic, but I love Nyanta because he's quite possibly the most believable character in the entire series, and the one who really sells me on the player base of Eldertale. Everyone in the show respects him, and he's a truly great guy, but there's always an ultra subtle playfulness in the dialogue over speculating his age, occupation, and real-life appearance or demeanor. I'm just gonna say it, Nyanta is definitely a furry. Moreover, he's an aged and probably relatively unattractive man IRL. They did give him the voice of Joji Nakata, one of the oldest actors in the business today, but one with an incredibly suave and sober voice that one can't help but be charmed by. A lot of the most faux charismatic people that I've known on the internet were fat old guys who leveraged their cool sounding voices to make a good impression, and there's nothing wrong with that, just as there's nothing wrong with hardcore role-playing as a cat person so much that you're ending every sentence with a nya. But if there's anyone whose passiveness towards the situation of having taken the form of his in-game avatar, in spite of it being largely inhuman, tells me something about who they might have been before they entered the game, it's Nyanta. And that's why he's an amazing character, because in this world there's no need to judge him on the basis of his interests or appearance. He literally is a cat boy now. That's just a thing that exists in this world, and his noble demeanor, which would come off off as some kind of goofy White Knight wannabe role player in a regular MMO doesn't even seem weird when there actually are real stakes to harassment and player killing. If you had Nyanta in your party in a real life game and he talked the same way that he does here, then he might come off as a kindly but incredibly strange man, whereas in this world he can just be the person he was pretending to be and happen to be better suited to this world than anyone else. Following some more re-establishment of previously discussed world building and further foreshadowing of important characters, Shiroi takes a fall and, post-eye catch, narrates one of the most personally relatable characterization scenes in anime. Simply put, Shiroi had always been a distant loner, but getting into Elder Tale and becoming a legendary player made him the center of attention for an endless stream of players looking for shallow engagement with him. This sequence is so short and so out of nowhere in the middle of this episode that I tend to forget about it when thinking back on the show. But the visual storytelling here is absolutely phenomenal. Shiroi doesn't have to tell us anything about how he looks at the people approaching him, because they're literally portrayed as status screens attached to a suit of gear with no human inside. From his perspective, he never really engaged with any of these people as human beings, only insofar as they were relevant to one another in the context of the game. As such, when these people who didn't really know anything about him and whom he never even learned the faces of started asking things from him, it became a pain in the ass. Just as important to the way that the players are portrayed here is the very specific emotion given to Shiroi. He all at once seems flattered that people are complimenting and relying on him, flustered and taken aback since he doesn't really know how to respond, and guarded by the falseness of his smile and the blacking out of his own personality. This is the face of someone who's trying to play the role being thrust on him by the people surrounding him, while his true self runs screaming into the back of his mind so that it doesn't have to confront them. Only after he's turned his face from the crowds regarding them as a pain in the ass, does he then find a home amid the debauchery tea party, who ask nothing of him but to join in their quest to find new and fun things in this world. I'm sure that no shortage of viewers would be able to relate to this sequence in their own ways. In my case, it's practically a one-to-one reflection of my early days of blowing up as a YouTuber, being surrounded by people praising and asking things of me, and a kind of attention which was at first gratifying and then tiring, until I found my own group of powerful adventurers to hang out with and ditch the rest of the world. The way that Shiroi is utterly dazzled by Kanami in this scene is also fascinating, in that it doesn't necessarily suggest a romantic attraction, but something more akin to having his soul reaffirmed by another person. We're going to have a lot more opportunities to talk about Shiroi and Kanami's relationship, but for now I'll drop a hint that if you've been paying attention to my otaku hero's journey narrative, which I've been weaving through videos like my No Game No Life and Steins Gate analyses, you'll know what I mean when I say that Kanami is the mad scientist to Shiroi's living computer. Continuing along is more banter, minor unsurprising character development like learning that Shiroi is an engineer, and foreshadowing for the next arc, with increasingly nice looking but sadly short-lived background art and a spattering of cute Akatsuki faces before we get to the zone change. I really love the way that this RPG conceit is communicated, with the color palette of the show shifting dramatically. In the context of an actual game, this would seem to happen for no reason and possibly be taken as immersion breaking, while in the context of a show about a game, it paradoxically heightens the immersion instead. After a quick battle with a boss monster, our heroes arrive at the beautiful sight of a sunset unlike anything they could have seen in the game. Unfortunately, I think this is one of the scenes which is undersold by the anime. After all, we just watched a very similar sunset in Shiroi's flashback, which was portrayed no differently from the rest of the show, even though it wouldn't have actually been experienced that way by Shiroi on his desktop window. I'm not sure if there's a good way that this could have been changed to make more sense, but it's just a shame because I didn't really think anything special about this scene the first time that I saw it, but it's actually pretty damn important to the narrative. After all, this is in fact the Log Horizon. Shiroi later names his guild that after the pride he felt at being the first adventurer in this new world to have witnessed a sight which no one had ever seen before, and it would have been nice if the show had done more to make us as viewers feel like this moment was truly something special so that it would sink in harder. After this scene, the episode rounds out with some buttering up for the big bad that our heroes will be up against at the end of the arc. It's worth mentioning that Log Horizon usually tries to end its episodes on some kind of cliffhanger or hint for next time, which is part of what makes it such an easy show to marathon. You've always got a taste of what's to come, and you just want to wolf it down as fast as possible. Now, I'm generally a strong advocate for refusing to participate in the paradigm of weekly viewing, and most of my favorite shows are ones which lend themselves better to the marathon format, and Log Horizon is definitely no exception. I imagine that keeping track of all of its moving parts would be pretty difficult to maintain over months and months of viewing unless you were invested enough to go back through the episodes or make a real effort to think about what you've seen, whereas watching it all at once makes the payoffs that much more satisfying when all of the setup is still fresh on your mind. Episode 4 finally closes out the introductory arc, starting with an explanation of the Half Gaia project which Elder Tales World was based on. That is, a project to create an entire half-scale planet Earth. I'd legitimately be interested to know what kind of tech was used to create this project, since while it does sound insanely ambitious, it doesn't seem impossible. After all, Daggerfall's world was twice the size of Great Britain, and that came out in 1996. While this episode is just as action-oriented as the last two, it manages to stay a lot more compelling right from the jump just because the obstructions in the hero's path are more relevant to their goal. Whereas the player killers in episode 2 or the entire dungeon from episode 3 just seemed like random roadblocks that they happened to stumble upon, the idea that the heroes must approach this rescue tactically because of the direct threat of the villains causing Sereda to need protection raises the tension of the scenario. Something this show does exceptionally well is using the logic baked into MMOs for newly creative situations. We'll have seen this in previous combat scenes already, but the first moment which I found especially clever was the reveal that our heroes couldn't simply meet with Sereda and Yanta outside of town, because if they got attacked on the way out, then our heroes would respawn in Akiba while Sereda would spawn in Susukino. Back when this was a game, that mechanic would have been nothing but convenient, but here it's a serious concern with massive consequences if the situation is handled wrongly. Of course, more importantly, this also gives the writer an excuse to force his heroes into the line of sight of their adversaries, making conflict avoidance unlikely. Sure, it's convenient, but only for the same reason that the heroes had to embark on this journey in the first place, because the transport gates are down. Eventually, this and a few other differences between the original game and its now real counterpart will be kind of justified, though it's pretty obvious that Tono selected which attributes to change on the basis of what would help him to tell the story he wanted. But I'm really glad that he kept this as minimal as possible and tried to justify as many story decisions via real MMORPG mechanics as he could imagine. Most of this episode's first half straightforwardly portrays the reuniting of Shiroe and Yanta, both formerly members of the Debauchery Tea Party, and the crew's departure from the town, inevitably building up to a huge confrontation with the Brigandia Guild and their big evil dipshit leader Demicus. Admittedly, Demicus comes off as a pretty weak character, and kind of falls into the trap that I usually accuse other shows like this of falling into, of portraying a player whose personality doesn't really seem all that congruent with that of a high-level MMO player. Not to say that these games don't bring people from all walks of life, but Demicus comes off as such an uncharismatic evil asshole that it's not really clear how he managed to put a guild together or to play with others up through this point. He's the kind of character who would make sense if this actually was a fantasy world where one could use physical strength to seize control of the weak, but there's no good reason that Demicus would actually be any more powerful than any other level 90 player in this world regardless of his physical size. How exactly Brigandia gained total control over Susukino without opposition from any other strong players or guilds is kind of brushed aside, and I suspect was just straight up a matter of Mamoru Tono's vision for the narrative in the long term not having solidified enough yet. As a one-off villain, Demicus is bland, average, and predictable. His second in command, while more believable as a character, isn't really any more original. Shockingly, both of these characters actually will be fully fleshed out and made legitimately interesting way later into the second season, but for a first-time viewer, there'd still be no reason to expect this show to go so far with these characters when this still looks like an action-adventure fantasy romp with a fair helping of cliché to go around. The fight in itself is kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it does feature extensively creative use of MMO combat mechanics and attacks, building on what we saw in episode 2 and establishing more of the rules of how different classes function and interact, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and how do those change in the context of the party members on their side. There are some pretty cool poses and shots throughout, and the heavy rock music, while very corny, is nonetheless entertaining. Still, animation and choreography are pretty minimal here. More of the impact is conveyed through clever transitions between shots than from the movement of the characters. It's also just incredibly long, and if you aren't engaged in the story at this point, then it will certainly seem to be dragging its feet. I know I sound like a broken record here, but again, this is something which I appreciated a bit more on the second viewing. Knowing that there actually isn't all that much combat in the show overall, and already being heavily invested in the characters and world from having seen the series all the way through, getting to watch them fight in a protracted, heavily tactical scenario was a lot more engaging, considering now I was watching it with the mindset of realizing just how much of badasses these characters whom I already love truly are. I love getting to see this more sadistic side of Shiroi, which he only reveals to people that he doesn't like, and it's even more meaningful when you know the feelings behind that attitude, which get explored in Season 2. His mispronunciation of Demicus's name all throughout this fight just seems like a fun running gag here, but later will pay off in one of the second season's biggest emotional sells, and that's the kind of shit that makes up the lifeblood of why this show rules so hard. And there you go, that wraps up Log Horizon's first and arguably worst arc. The first 2 episodes are insanely dense with detail and intrigue, while the third and fourth mostly serve to reiterate the parts that you'll need to have paid the most attention to going forward, and then get all of the information about how combat and exploration in this world works out of the way, so that we won't have to stop the momentum to do it later when the ball is rolling in earnest. You could almost say that this arc kind of sacrificed itself on the altar of helping the rest of the show to make sense. It's an unfortunate consequence of the light novel format that these books are generally expected to tell self-contained stories while building a continuous narrative, and thus feel the need to come to a head in some kind of large confrontation. But with as much as this one would need to have set up before it could really deliver on something earth-shatteringly dramatic, it instead had to break off and churn out a generic one-time filler boss to give the first book a climax, and the anime adaptation was just kinda stuck with no real way to remedy that. Considering how it will absolutely go on to justify all of this in the long run, I'm not exactly complaining. I've talked to a lot of people who gave up on Log Horizon relatively early, usually after 4 or 5 episodes, and I mostly dug into this arc so hard in consideration for my understanding of that sentiment. I definitely remember being less interested in the fight scenes and generic fantasy trappings of these early episodes than I was with the world building, but I was so engaged by said world building and with the general visual and narrative tone of the series that it was not a struggle to get through these episodes for me at all, and that's why I also wanted to break down every subtle detail which endeared me to the series so that you'd have a sense for why the man who drops plenty of shows after just a few seconds would defend the start of a show which, by his own admittance, doesn't truly pick up until after its first arc. Of course, I also had to do so while acknowledging that I had even less qualms with the arc on the rewatch, and how I'd encourage anyone who liked this show to go through it again. In the next part of this series, I'll be diving into the second arc where the show truly gets good and finally delivers on some of my favorite scenes in anime history. If you want to hear me talk about some actual RPGs and not just fictional ones in anime, head over to the I Am Games channel where I recently started a series breaking down every game in the Tales of series. And be sure to support me on Patreon if you like what you see here and want to help me to continue homesteading the noosphere of anime. Thanks again for watching, I'll see you in the next one.